Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. My name is Debbie Kay. I have the honor of being the League President. I hope you are feeling encouraged by the continuing positive trends in managing the pandemic and the rollout of vaccines. The League is dedicated to making democracy work. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present programs like this to give our Portland and Multnomah County neighbors the opportunity to think about the issues that affect our lives and well-being. Because tonight's panel discussion centers on climate crisis and environmental justice, as we begin the program, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. Many people of color are harmed by the practices that have led to our climate crisis. That harm has been experienced the longest by Native Americans. As Dr. Raymond Foxworth, Vice President at the First Nations Development Institute, wrote in the nonprofit Quarterly, environmental racism is not colorblind and has a direct impact on Native communities as well as other communities of color. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of many tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River and its tributaries. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the original stewards and protectors of these lands over thousands of years. Systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation still impact many Indigenous and Native American families today, as does the climate crisis. We recognize that Portland is a community of many diverse communities of color. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Black and Indigenous people of color, past, present, and future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. We're pleased to have you join our program today, featuring 4 expert speakers from organizations that are committed to addressing our climate crisis. We're eager to help the public learn about the implications and potential future risks of climate change and the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. Our media partner, Metro East Community Media, records our civic education panels and voter education presentations and rebroadcasts them on community access channels. Please tell your family and friends to watch this program when it is available through our website, lwvpdx.org, on or after March 12th. The League is pleased that our programs are supported by the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation, the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund, and Metro East Community Media. We thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise to bring these programs to you. And now I will introduce our moderator for this program, our esteemed colleague, League member, Dr. Robin Tokmakian. Robin has represented the League of Women Voters of the United States as part of the Observer Corps to the United Nations since 2017, with an emphasis on climate issues. She also serves as the League of Women Voters of Oregon's representative to the Northwest Energy Coalition. I'll now turn the program over to you, Robin.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. The climate crisis is a global crisis, and our local actions can contribute to the rate of reducing greenhouse gas emissions on a national and a global scale. How can Portland and Oregon help the UN meet its climate goal of holding the Earth's temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit? We are looking forward to hearing from 4 accomplished climate leaders and advocates on how their organizations are addressing our climate crisis. Each of our speakers will have 12 minutes for their remarks before we open up the program to questions. Our first speaker is Katie Lister. She's Deputy Director of the Portland Clean Energy Fund. Ms. Lister has nearly 20 years of experience in advocating for renewable energy and community engagement. She will update us on the Portland Clean Energy Fund and discuss the fund's connection to environmental justice and to Portland's Climate Action Plan. Ms. Lister, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and try and speed through this to keep things on time. So can everybody see, can the folks on the screen, can you see my screen? Can I get, okay, great. So thank you again for having me. My name is Katie Lister. I am the Deputy Program Manager for the Portland Clean Energy Fund, and my boss, Sam Barrasso, asked me to kind of sit in for him and be here tonight. He has 2 little children. I have 2 adult children, so this is how the evening things go these days. So what is PCEF? PCEF is a fund's climate action that advances racial and social justice. It's the first ballot initiative in Oregon, the first environmental measure, rather, that was created and led by communities of color. It was passed by ballot initiative by more than 65% of voters in Portland, and is estimated to generate about $40 to $60 million annually for clean energy investments within the city of Portland. The money comes from a 1% gross receipts tax on sales in Portland by corporations that have both $1 billion in sales nationally and $500,000 or greater in annual sales in the Portland area. There are some exemptions to that for things like groceries and utilities and a few other items. So what does PCEF fund? PCEF has some pretty specific target funding areas that were in the ballot initiative and then were transferred over into the code. And those include about 40 to 60% for clean energy programs. Those are things like energy efficiency and renewable energy. Also, I always like to tell people, don't try and add up the numbers on this pie chart, because they don't add up to the right number, but they are the ones that were in the code and in the ballot initiative, and they're just funding targets. The next kind of biggest chunk there is 20 to 25% for investments in contractor training and support and workforce development, trying to create a more diverse workforce, getting people into family wage jobs to support the green economy. 10 to 15% will be invested in green infrastructure and regenerative agriculture projects. And then there's this sort of 5%, which is called innovation and is really kind of an other category. It's any projects or programs that meet the objectives of the program, which are to address climate change and advance racial justice, but don't fit neatly into any of the other categories. So why does PCEF center equity? I think often when we hear people talk about why they center equity in environmental work or in the work that they're doing in general, we hear a lot of evidence demonstrating the harm that systemic racism, misogyny, and poverty have and continue to cause. And this is important and real. Place, income, housing quality all affect our ability to respond to general stressors, and certainly climate stressors such as extreme heat and wildfire smoke, vector-borne diseases, or any of the other sort of climate impacts that we are currently seeing and anticipate seeing more of. Researchers have found that many households with high energy burdens also live in older, inefficient, and unhealthy housing. Inefficient housing is associated with other health impacts such as carbon monoxide poisoning, lead poisoning, thermal discomfort, and respiratory problems such as asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Households experiencing energy insecurity may forego needed energy use to reduce energy bills, forcing them to live in uncomfortable and unsafe homes. Nationally, we see 43% higher incidence of energy burden for Black households, 20% higher for Latinx households, and 45% higher for Native American households. And that's energy burden sort of defined as when you pay more than 6% of your income on energy bills. There's clear and compelling evidence that climate programs, as they have existed, have not served well those who are most impacted by the effects of climate change, people of color and people with low incomes. But the thing that I find most exciting about centering equity in our work is that it allows the really brilliant ideas of communities that have been historically marginalized to be elevated and brought to the fore. People who are closest to and most impacted by an issue are the most likely to offer solutions that will address those impacts. I come from a family of scientists, and so I often think about how scientific teams are put together, and really am excited about the trend I see in that field too, of toward creating teams that have a lot of gender and racial diversity when assembling for research projects. And this is because having a diversity of lenses through which information is being consumed just lets us see more and leads us to more comprehensive understanding and better outcomes. The PCESS program is committed to trusting communities and remaining open to ideas that we may not have considered before. Our priority populations, we kind of have two different priority populations depending on the types of project. And this is, again, from the ballot initiative and outlined in the code. For clean energy, regenerative agriculture, and green infrastructure projects, our priority populations are people of color and people with low incomes. For workforce and contractor development projects, it's a little bit more expansive and includes women, people of color, people with disabilities, and people who are chronically underemployed. This is how funds are accessed. Only nonprofits are eligible to apply to PCESS funds. So we are actually kind of just wrapping up our first request for proposal, our first solicitation. We got a bunch of applications from nonprofits. They went through an eligibility screening and a technical screening. Were sent on to scoring panels that were comprised of subject matter experts, committee members, and staff. All of our scoring panels were majority people of color. And we tried to have gender diversity also on all of our scoring panels. Those scores then go to the PCESS committee, and there's a picture there of our committee. I would note that there's one of those committee members is no longer on our committee. She stepped down. One thing that the committee, which is sort of our governing body, recognized early on was a real absence of anyone who could bring an Indigenous perspective. And so one of our members stepped aside, and we made space for a recruitment to solicit or to sort of seat a committee member that could bring that perspective, which we now have with a new member, Amanda Squinfagnazi, who is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and a descendant of Navajo, Wasco, and the Yakima people. So these folks, we just don't have a new photo because it's been pandemic times. We haven't been able to gather everyone and get a good shot. These folks just recently kind of approved a portfolio of recommended projects that we will send to City Council. We on April 1st is when we have a council date, and then City Council, if all goes well, will approve that, and we will be able to kind of be off and running with our first grantees. We got 140 applications, 133 of them were found to be eligible and feasible. And I won't go into the details of this slide too much. I assume that this will be able to be posted afterwards, and with my contact information, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has, but just in the interest of time, I'll point out a couple of things. We had $8.6 million in this first round to give, or to spend, and we got applications for more than $30 million, or requests for more than $30 million. 56 of those were applications for planning grants. There's definitely a lot of pent-up demand to be able to spend time planning to develop good projects. And the other thing that I would point out is that more than half of our of the applicant organizations that applied for PCESS grants have staff and leadership and boards where more than 50% of them reflect the communities, the priority populations that they intend to serve. And we asked for a lot of demographic information within the applications to sort of be able to sort of make that assessment. So if you are an organization that intends to provide service and benefit to the Latinx community, you were able to, we wanted to see that more than 50% of your staff, more than 50% of your board, and more than 50% of your staff leadership were Latinx people. This is another slide that has a lot of information. This is the portfolio of projects that is going to be, that the committee is recommending to council. It's 45 grants totaling $8.6 million. 86% of funds are going to organizations that reflect PCESS priority populations. 38% of funds are going to small or emerging organizations, and we define those as less than 3 years old, or they have fewer than 6 full-time year-round employees. And half of projects in this portfolio include physical improvements. The committee decided to chose to recommend a portfolio that had a lot of planning grants in it. There's 29 planning grants, with the idea that we want to have well-developed good projects in the future, and also that we are investing in communities that have not been in the past resourced to do this kind of planning activity. This is my last slide, and this is a slide that we often put at the beginning of our presentations, and I just decided to end with it and just kind of note that, you know, we're really excited in the program to be on the verge of getting our first grantees approved by council, and are simultaneously evaluating the most recent solicitation and gearing up to release another request for proposal in late summer 2021. And all of this activity is informed by these guiding principles, which were developed by our committee to describe the values by which our program is to be administered. So I just wanted to maybe take the last minute of my presentation to to read part of the guiding principles, that our program is to be administered, and the program will be focused on climate action with multiple benefits, investing in people, livelihoods, places, and processes that build climate resilience and community wealth, foster healthy communities, and support regenerative systems, avoid and mitigate displacement, especially resulting from gentrification pressures. That the program is going to be justice-driven, advancing systems change that address historic and current discrimination, center all disadvantaged and marginalized groups, particularly Black and Indigenous people, that it will be community-powered, trusting community knowledge, experience, innovation, and leadership, that it will honor and build on existing work and partnerships while supporting capacity building for emerging community groups and diverse coalitions, engage with and invest in community-driven approaches that foster community power to create meaningful change, and that we will be accountable to the communities that the program is intended to serve, accountable to the voters of Portland, sort of just accountable as public servants who are administering public funds, that we will implement transparent funding, oversight, and engagement processes that promote continuous learning, programmatic checks and balances, and improvement, demonstrate achievement of equitable social, economic, and environmental benefit, and remain accountable to target beneficiaries, grantees, and all Portlanders. So I can't emphasize enough that every decision that the program makes really looks back to these guiding principles and asks and kind of holds any decision point up to those principles, and asks if we are kind of remaining consistent with those values.
Thank you, Ms. Lester. Yeah, thank you. Our next speaker will be Oriana Magnera, who is Verde's Energy and Climate Policy Coordinator. Her focus is on community-led participation and program development. She is a member of the Oregon Global Warming Commission and Portland's Planning and Sustainability Commission. She will discuss the transition to zero-emission transportation, as well as how to design programs that improve equity of access for vulnerable communities. So Ms. Magnera, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm about to share my screen. And I will go and present it. Thanks all for your patience. So my name is Oriana Magnera. I'm the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Manager at Verde. I actually will not be focusing on the electrification of transportation side of things, although I'm happy to answer questions if folks have about that particular topic, but really want to hone in on how to do this work in a way that is equitable and justice driven. And that's me. You can see me down or to the right in a little box. But I work for an organization called Verde. And Verde's mission is to serve communities by building environmental wealth through social enterprise, organizing, and advocacy. Verde came about 15 years ago when rain gardens were coming in all around Portland. The founder saw where they were going in, which was mostly white, wealthier neighborhoods, not in neighborhoods like Cully, which is where Verde organizes. And Cully is a neighborhood that is mostly Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, mostly Latinx and Indigenous. And it is also a neighborhood that is mostly folks with lower incomes. There aren't a lot of sidewalks in Cully. There's not a lot of infrastructure. Those kinds of improvements like rain gardens just weren't things that were happening in the community. And we're still fighting to get sidewalks in the neighborhood and some of the other infrastructure improvements that we need. But our founder saw that disparity in infrastructure and wanted to figure out how to bring things like rain gardens and other improvements to a community like Cully, but also with the recognition that when those improvements come to a neighborhood like Cully, the risk of displacement is high because home values go up, which means that a landlord is more likely to sell a home or raise the rent, or there are just pressures in the community in that regard. And Verde is about keeping communities stable and resilient in the sense of being tied together in addition to being prepared for whatever comes and being able to receive services as needed, no matter the event. And Verde wanted to approach this work in a way that allowed these projects to happen, but fought displacement in the process. So that's where social enterprise came in. For a long time. Unfortunately, we had to shut it down last year because of COVID. We had a landscaping social enterprise that installed rain gardens in Cully and other parts of the city and did education work around rain gardens. So we built capacity for community through this work. And then that blossomed into doing energy work during the ARA years when we had a lot of stimulus money for energy efficiency. Verde did energy efficiency and home retrofits. Now I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work that's happening in our space, but really Verde's mission is to allow communities to have access to these kinds of infrastructure, to clean energy, to the sorts of things that our communities have been shut out of for too long. And just in the way that the Portland Clean Energy Fund is intended to move resources to the communities who are most impacted by climate change, we're all about mobilizing those communities to make those resources truly viable and to turn them into projects that are meaningful. Before we dig into the work that we do, I want to give a little bit of context. Katie talked about energy burden, that if you have more than 6% of your income going towards your energy bills, you're energy burdened. This map is from the Oregon Department of Energy Biennial Energy Report, and it shows where Oregon is most energy burdened. And this was done before COVID. And my next slide will talk about what's happening now with folks with regard to energy. But as you can see, Oregon is an incredibly energy burdened state. Even the yellow counties are up to 30% of the people who are below 200% of federal poverty line are energy burdened. And our most energy burdened counties are Eastern Oregon, especially Southeastern Oregon. So it's a big issue in the state, and it's a big issue in the Cully community as well. When we first went into COVID, we did some organizing to find out what was going on for our community, what their concerns were. And their first concern was figuring out how to pay rent, especially before the eviction moratorium was put into place. And one of the other things they were very concerned about was paying their utility bills. Energy burden shutoffs were problems long before COVID came along, but they were exacerbated significantly. So creating solutions through energy projects that help communities to save on their energy bills through energy efficiency, or solar panels on the roof that allow for a lower bill through net metering are very crucial to communities. Something like energy assistance is just a one shot that helps someone cover a large bill, but it doesn't create the holistic change that we really want to see and put people to work doing those projects. So Verde is founded in the idea of environmental justice, and I want to frame what that means more. And I think it's helpful to first talk about what an environmentalist is. And this is a slide that actually comes from Community Energy Project and a presentation we did together, but I really like using it because it creates a strong contrast. When we think of a traditional environmentalist, we think of somebody who drives an electric vehicle or rides a bicycle. We think of someone who has solar panels on their roof. These are all things that people buy. So we think of environmentalists as people who use their buying power to do things that help make the planet better. But when we actually think about what makes the biggest difference when it comes to reducing an individual carbon footprint, It's folks who walk or take public transportation. It's people who buy things secondhand. It's people who live in multifamily housing. And that's mostly folks with lower incomes. So our idea of who the most environmentally friendly people are is not always accurate to who is really living in ways that are reducing the carbon footprint of our city. So environmental justice is the fair distribution of benefits and burdens of environmental health hazards like pollution and meaningful participation in decisions that impact the environment and people where they live, work, learn, and play. And that's the definition from the Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force. So we're really focused on preventing harm, providing benefit, and doing so through an inclusive and accountable decision-making process. And when we think about who an environmental justice community is, that's Cully. We are the neighborhood closest to the airport. Our office is across a diesel trucking corridor from a rail line. We have the Owens Brockway bottle recycling facility. We have the Porter Yet asphalt facility. There's an incredible amount of pollution in the Cully neighborhood, which is mostly Black and brown folks, mostly folks with lower incomes, who are the folks who are most likely to be in environmental justice communities. And our broad theory of change is not just focused on the individual things we can do, the kind of tote bag environmentalism, but really thinking about how do we change things on the broad scale? How do we make the system change that is needed to move from an extractive economy? And we don't think about it just in terms of what we're drawing from the ground, but how we're extracting labor, how we're extracting resources from our communities and moving to a system that is more regenerative. And PSEF, I think, is an incredible example of what that vision can look like, how we can hold corporations accountable for the pollution and impacts they have on our communities and move those resources to those very communities to ensure that we can do projects in ways that are meaningful and help to build that resiliency within community. So Verde puts that into practice in a number of different ways. And one of those ways is through the Cully Energy Plan. We have an energy plan for the Cully neighborhood, which uses conservation and generation projects to help communities stay in their homes through lower energy bills, build wealth, create jobs, and foster that community resiliency I keep talking about. And the projects include education around solar that builds off of our rain garden education. We've done manufactured home replacement in a manufactured housing community that we helped to take from being owned by a for-profit entity to being owned by a nonprofit so that it's stable and safe for the community. And now they have energy efficient homes. We put solar panels on the St. Charles Church on 42nd Avenue, are going to add storage so that it can be a place that is islanded, which means if we have an event like the winter weather we had a few weeks ago, where folks lose power, a place that's not connected to the grid or can be disconnected from the grid can function in its own system, and people could come to St. Charles to charge their phones, to be warm, to be safe, to be in community. We have a ductless heat pump co-op, and that funny looking device under the person in the bottom right is a ductless heat pump. And it is a heating and cooling device that pulls the hot air out of a room in the summer or pulls the cold air out of a room in the winter, and is incredibly efficient. It also works as an air filtration device. So we're also helping folks with the air quality issues. And then lastly, we bought and then demolished a strip club in the Cully neighborhood that now will be replaced with 141 units of affordable housing that will be in a sustainable building. At the end of the day, it's about people and community. That is what is driving the work that we do in most meaningful ways. And the second way we're trying to put that into practice is through the Oregon Clean Energy Opportunity Campaign, which is founded in the idea that we are trying to, at the legislative and statewide level, decrease utility costs, create good local jobs and renewable energy in the process, all while reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 100% below or 100% completely clean electricity by 2040. And through that, increasing opportunities for rural and tribal communities and other environmental justice communities. And we're also developing leadership for frontline communities through an Energy Justice Leadership Institute, in which we have over 100 community members from around the state participating in English and Spanish to learn about energy and energy policy, and then put that into practice as advocates for a set of 3 bills that I'll describe in just a moment. And the third phase of Energy Justice Leadership Institute, we're hoping will be focused on project development. helping people take the incredible ideas that they have and put them into practice and help create an incubator where they can figure out how to connect to the resources that help them achieve their dreams. And this is a campaign that is significant because it's a statewide climate legislative campaign that is led by environmental justice organizations. And these are some of the folks on our steering committee. And we're also working with allied environmental and energy organizations in the process of developing these concepts, which are 100% clean energy for all. It's actually House Bill 2021 right now. It's kind of shifted vehicles, but would approach 100% renewable and clean energy by 2040 in a way that is just, that maximizes community benefits and minimizes environmental justice burdens. We have an energy affordability bill that would allow for different rates for folks with lower incomes or different rate classes, and create a set of funding for organizations like Verde to participate in utility regulation. That's House Bill 2475. And then House Bill 2842, which was just announced as part of the Speaker's housing agenda, is a healthy homes bill, which would move $20 million towards home retrofits that supplement existing weatherization work and ensure that people have healthy and safe homes. So we're doing a lot at Verde right now to really push the envelope, to really ensure that community is leading in this work in a way that is meaningful, that folks can create projects and ensure that they have stable, livable communities. I'll be happy to answer questions after Tim presents. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker will be Tim Miller, the director of the Oregon Business for Climate. He will discuss the important role of business in addressing the climate change crisis. He serves on a number of boards, number of climate policy organizations, and has provided strategic consulting to over 30 clean tech companies, nonprofit, and agencies. He has launched his own clean tech startup in the transportation sector. So the floor is yours, Tim.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Portland for asking us all to come together for this conversation. Debbie, it's good to see you again. It's been a little while. And Oriana, good to see you. And we talk often. Director Whitman, good to see you. And Robin and Katie, hello, good to meet you. So I thought, as you just heard, my name is Tim Miller, and I'm the director of Oregon Business for Climate. I'm not going to use any slides, so I'll just give you a quick outline. I'm going to quickly cover my background and my perspective so you have a feeling for where I'm coming from. And then I'll talk a little bit about what Oregon Business for Climate is and some of the bills that we are supporting in the legislature this year. Led by others, but where we are lending a hand to support these bills. So I mentioned that I'm the director of Oregon Business for Climate. That's a great post for me to be in. I really appreciate it because I love Oregon. I have a business background and I'm very passionate about the climate. So those three things come together really well in this role. My business background is from working in high tech and low tech and online and consulting environments, from startups to big companies, and working across a bunch of different functions from manufacturing to marketing and sales and general management. Along with doing this work, just to get a sense of how I'm thinking about this, I also work with an organization called PECI, and our job is to fund other nonprofits who are working to advance policies at the nexus of climate and equity. So in transportation and in the built environment, and funding some environmental justice organizations or positions at those organizations. And then I'm also on a couple of boards doing work related in these areas, the Board of Climate Solutions and the Board of Forth, which is an organization that's advancing transportation electrification and smart transportation and things like that with an equity lens. So that's it all. For me, it all comes together around climate all the time. And how can business help in advancing the climate conversation? Well, at Oregon Business for Climate, our mission is to advance urgent, ambitious, and equitable climate policies and programs with an eye to having those programs spur innovation and economic opportunity and effectively and responsibly reducing emissions. So that's sort of all those concepts come together around in the bills that we want to support. And we believe that climate leadership is really critical for Oregon's industries. We see this as an opportunity. Some folks don't see it that way, but we really see addressing climate change as essential for Oregon's people and our communities and our industries, and that it really is a way to help drive progress so that our state can reemerge as a leader in the growing clean economy. It seems really clear to us that we all need to move in this direction, so we should be leaders in that regard and have that be a way that we can bring benefits to Oregon communities, and do that in a way that we're always thinking about everyone in the state and bringing an equity perspective to all that work. We're nearly 100 companies working together on this work and bringing our voices together in industries spanning from healthcare to clean energy to storage technologies to retail, transportation, just across the board. And we're the only statewide organization bringing this voice of business to this perspective. Some business organizations are bringing a different voice, and we think it's important that we can bring a voice that says this is the right thing to do, and it's good for our economy and good for Oregon. So some of the policies we are supporting are some that Oriana just mentioned, and Oriana, I really want to applaud you. You're very modest, but you are a real leader on many of these bills, and thank you so much for your work. 100% clean energy for all, a super important bill. We're supporting it. You mentioned it's now HB 2021, moving us toward 100% clean electricity. For a lot of companies who are wanting to have 100% clean energy in their message, it's great for the state to be moving in that direction, and helps everybody get there faster, and driving community benefits and job creation benefits, family wage jobs. All those things together need to go hand in hand. Second one we're supporting is energy efficient local building codes. We think it makes sense for cities to be able to say, we want our buildings to be more efficient than just the baseline code requirement, and we want to require that in our city. And if a city comes together and decides that they want to do that, we think they should have the option to do that. So that's the REACH code bill, HB 2398, I believe is what it was, and I think it still is. Another one we're supporting is the Energy Trust extension, HB 3141. Some folks may have heard about this. The Energy Trust has done tremendous work for families in their homes, as well as for businesses and others, advancing their energy efficiency, and we want that work to continue. We think it's good for not only the families and the businesses who are improving the efficiency in their buildings, but also for the folks who are doing the work to do that energy efficiency. And as Oriana pointed out, there's a lot of other benefits that come along when you make something more efficient. You can get health benefits and all kinds of other benefits too. Just a few more bills to mention here, and then I'll wrap it up and look forward to questions. We're also supporting the energy affordability bill, one of the ones I believe that Oriana mentioned, establishing bill protections for low-income ratepayers, and also supporting frontline organizations' ability to bring their voice to conversations at the Public Utility Commission. Really important to support that work, support all those voices coming together, because the Public Utility Commission makes really important decisions, and we support having the right voices in the room when those decisions are being made. Appliance efficiency standards. This is HB 2062. We think it makes sense for Oregon's businesses and for Oregonians to save money on the use of their appliances in their homes and in their businesses. There's no reason that Oregon should be behind Washington and California in the efficiency standards of our appliances, so we totally support HB 2062. The black carbon bill, this is one that Director Whitman may have a perspective on. It I think, would affect some of the work at DEQ, where black carbon is, this bill would ask that black carbon be considered in the definition of greenhouse emissions or climate forcing emissions, and has a big effect in a more short-term way than CO2, but many times more impactful in the short term. So we support the inclusion of that, HB 2479 in the bill, in the definition. And the last bill would be that we're supporting right now is to bring equity and climate considerations into our land use planning. we have land use goals that were established in the 70s and modified a little bit here and there, but it's high time that climate get called out specifically and that environmental justice get called out specifically in those land use planning goals. What it says in those goals end up affecting a lot of decisions. So those major considerations ought to be in the goals. And then finally, the last bit of work that we're working on is being involved in a program that Director Whitman is probably going to tell us about, the Climate Protection Program. Oriana and I are both on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee to help shape a program that helps the Department of Environmental Quality will run to help us reduce our emissions over time, and supporting the creation of a strong program that really does that in a way that brings benefits to all Oregonians and helps spur innovation and move our economy along. So those are the things we're supporting right now. It's a really important season with the legislature doing its job, and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for your remarks. So our last speaker will be Director Richard Whitman, who's the director of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. He will discuss what DEQ is doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including addressing the governor's executive order, I hope, and DEQ's involvement in the legislative bills. And we hope also to hear about the proposed move of the Environmental Justice Task Force into DEQ and why that is important. So, Director Whitman, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, League of Women Voters. Can everyone see my screen okay there? Great, thank you. Today is actually the 1-year anniversary of Governor Kate Brown's executive order on climate. So it's a great time to be talking to you all about where we're at on actions to deal with the climate crisis facing Oregon. There's another important thing that happened today, and that is that the state released an updated version of its climate adaptation framework, which is a report looking at what are the major risks to Oregon communities from climate change. The first version of that was done back in 2010, and this is an important update, and a lot has happened in 10 years. Part of that adaptation framework is also a climate equity blueprint and tools for Oregon agencies to better understand what communities are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and to help us work with those communities to avoid putting more of a burden than has already been placed on those communities in terms of public health and pollution burden. So a lot going on in this area. We also obviously have a brand new federal administration that is starting to show bits and pieces of where it may be going on climate work. So in about 10 minutes, I'm going to try to wrap all of that together and give you just a very high level overview of what's going on in Oregon in the work, primarily on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, reducing those emissions. But I want to start out with climate change and the climate crisis. We all lived through the Labor Day fires of last fall, which was just a terrible experience, but I'm afraid is indicative of what we're likely to see in Oregon. The frequency of large fire in Western Oregon used to be on average about once every 100 years, an area would have a major wildfire in Western Oregon. That time period, because of climate change, is reduced to about 50 years, and it's shrinking still. So wildfire is a new reality for us in Western Oregon that we're going to be dealing with. We've got also highlighted in the adaptation report that just came out today, disease, and particularly heat and disease and their impacts on vulnerable communities that don't have the building infrastructure to be able to live through long periods of high heat. We've seen those episodes in Europe and other parts of the world, and with fatal consequences in communities. And again, very concerning here in Oregon. And then finally, in the area of water resources, Oregon, Washington, California are unique in their dependence on snowpack for our water resources. And that reservoir, that natural reservoir is going away, and it's going away very rapidly, and with big implications not only for agriculture, a mainstay of our rural economy, but also for water supply and water quality throughout the state. So with that somewhat depressing beginning to the presentation, let me talk a little bit about what we're doing. The goal here is to put Oregon back on track to be a leader nationally and globally in terms of doing our part for what we collectively, I mean, we, everybody in Oregon, everybody in the US, everybody in the world needs to do in order to avoid those worst impacts of climate change. So at a minimum, that means very steep declines in greenhouse gas emissions over the next 30 years, getting to something like at least 45% below 1990 levels by 2035, and at least 80% by 2050. Ideally, faster and further, if at all possible. We're already far off track in terms of meeting our climate reduction goals, and the more we can accelerate and show leadership for the rest of the nation and world, the better. A little bit about the specific nature of greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. Oriana already talked quite a little bit about transportation. I'm going to talk some more about transportation. Heating our homes and our businesses, residential and commercial energy use is another significant sliver. And then our industries is about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. Those three slices, industrial, residential, commercial, transportation, are the pieces that Oregon DEQ is focused on. The electricity use piece that's here is also significant. And in order for us to get to those bigger numbers in terms of reductions, getting to cleaner electric grid for Oregon and for the nation is absolutely critical. All the studies that have been done that show how we get to an 80 or 90 or 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, it's by electrifying and by making the generation for that electricity 100% clean. And the legislative effort that is going on that Oriana and others are playing a leading role in is critically important in Oregon in terms of our long-term success in meeting our climate reduction goals. So I do want to talk about transportation a bit, because transportation is all of us. We're all part of this problem. And in order for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, we need cleaner fuels, we need cleaner vehicles, and we need to drive less, walk more, use other modes more. Those three legs of the stool. So DEQ has a leading role in this area. We are the state agency that adopts efficiency standards. We are able to follow California's lead under federal law. So to the extent that California adopts more aggressive emission standards, mileage standards for passenger and freight vehicles, we can follow California. We have an existing clean fuels program in Oregon that has been very successful and frankly is a model for a lot of our work. And one piece of the governor's executive order on climate was for us to extend that program to achieve a 25% reduction in carbon intensity by 2035. What does that mean? That means renewable fuels, and it means electrifying our transportation also. Those two things are the way that we reduce carbon intensity in transportation. There is other important work going on in the transportation sector, including efforts to allow people to drive less. The energy burden on vulnerable communities is in part a heating burden, but it is also a transportation energy burden on communities. And so particularly making vulnerable communities more resilient to a future in which, frankly, gasoline and diesel prices are probably going to go up some. And so providing other modes, other means for communities, particularly households in lower income communities, to be able to get around and get to work, get to school, get to all the community services that are part of life. So another piece of the transportation puzzle is we're not just talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. An important co-benefit of the climate work is also, to the extent we reduce greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles and trucks, we're also going to be reducing the emissions that cause public health problems. This is a map that shows levels over our health benchmarks for diesel particulate matter in the Portland metro area from a few years ago. But by reducing those vehicle emissions, we can reduce one of the major sources of diesel particulate in the Portland area. And frankly, you'll see similar maps, not just for Portland, but all up and down the Willamette Valley in Salem, Eugene, Corvallis, even down in Medford. All right, so in addition to working on specifically on transportation, I want to talk a little bit about the climate protection program. That really is the umbrella program to assure that we meet our reduction targets. And how does it work? It works essentially by setting caps on greenhouse gas emissions resulting from everybody's use of fuels, transportation fuels, and then also in particular natural gas. That is, those two things together are the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions. And the program will set a limit, and that limit will decline over time. And one of the major policy issues that the agency is looking at with the input from the Rules Advisory Committee now is how far and how fast. And the governor's executive order has some targets in it. Those are, I would take as the governor's policy direction to the agency. We could go farther, we could go faster than the governor has said. And that's some of the discussion that will occur in the Rules Advisory Committee, and then ultimately in a body called the Environmental Quality Commission that I'm going to talk about in a minute. We also will be setting caps on some of the largest stationary sources in Oregon, mainly industrial sources. And together, these make up about 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. I'd love to talk, and I do want to talk a bit about the key goals in the program. So obviously, a program that's effective in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions is a necessary part of a serious program. A program that is also cost effective, that is at least cognizant of the price impacts we may be having on gasoline and natural gas, and works with other programs like the legislation that Oriana mentioned around differential utility rates to make this more affordable, particularly for our more vulnerable communities, is an important part of the program. And then finally, equity, centering equity in this program. And again, being very intentional about not putting additional disproportionate burdens on our most vulnerable BIPOC in other communities around the state, whether they're urban or rural. And as Oriana showed, many of those communities are actually in rural parts of the state. So those are the main goals of the climate protection program. I've already talked a little bit about how by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we can also reduce other types of pollution in vulnerable communities. And some of the work that we're doing in the policy making right now is to actually analyze those potential co-benefits and show what the health benefits of different scenarios and different program design elements might be. So we're not just considering cost in this, we're also considering, in the traditional sense, we are also very much looking at health benefits and health cost. All right. I think in the interest of time, I've already talked about most of this. Again, the program will be designed to at least hit those 2035 and 2050 goals by caps that decline over time. So a little bit about process. Why are we talking about this thing in an agency now rather than talking about the legislature? Well, you may remember that the Oregon legislature was not able to reach a decision on a climate program in 2020. And unfortunately, we had a walkout from the legislature by a group of senators who kept the legislature from being able to function. And so Governor Brown has, through her executive order, given direction to a whole range of state agencies, including DEQ, to use existing authorities. And that is, we can't go beyond what the legislature has already authorized us to do, but use existing authorities to do as much as we can do to meet these climate reduction goals. And that's what we're in the middle of right now. And the goal is by the end of this year to have a proposal ready for the Environmental Quality Commission, otherwise known as EQC. And I'll just note, by the way, Katie's boss, Sam Barrasso, is my vice chair of the Environmental Quality Commission. And Kathleen George, with a Grand Ronde Tribal Council member, is the chair of the Environmental Quality Commission. And we have 3 other members from across the state of Oregon. They will be making the final decision on this program around the end of this year, and then to be begun implemented starting in 2022. Okay, while you have this contact information up, I just want to mention a couple of other things. The Governor Brown also convened her Racial Justice Council, looking at equity issues, particularly coming out of the pandemic, but also looking a little bit more broadly. And there are some recommendations coming out of that council also with regard to an existing body in Oregon, the Environmental Justice Task Force, which was set up in 2009 and which has the responsibility to advise a set of Oregon agencies around environmental justice issues. The Environmental Justice Task Force does great work, but they're volunteers. They have no staff and no resources other than their volunteer time. And in fairness to the people who put in volunteer time, and if we're really serious about the environmental justice work in Oregon, it needs to be resourced. And so the governor has proposed in Senate Bill 286 to move the task force to the Department of Environmental Quality, provide its staffing, provide us with the responsibility for giving resources to the council, and also rename it as the council. And that's an important signal also that this is a permanent body that has ongoing permanent responsibilities for working with Oregon agencies to help them reduce burdens on vulnerable communities in the work that we do generally. Another key part of that is development of an Oregon-specific tool that is mirrored on work that has gone on in other states that allows us to do a vulnerability assessment at the community level of potential impacts to communities of both policy choices and program implementation, and allows us to better avoid those impacts and, in fact, actually start to reverse some of the historic burdens that have been placed on those communities. So I would say that bill, along with the 2021, the 100% clean, and the environmental affordability legislation that was also mentioned, are for us, along with the recycling bill that we're working on, the 4 important pieces of legislation that we're really focused on in this session. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. We're going to go on to questions now from the audience, but first I want to give you guys the opportunity, if you have questions, to ask of each other. No? So I have a question that's for the Portland Clean Energy Fund. And I don't know, Katie, I guess you're the one that could address this, but also Oriana might have some input. So can you give an example of some of the projects that have requested funds, and was Verde one of the organizations that requested funds?
Okay, am I unmuted? I can't speak right now to specific projects because they're not public yet. So we are filing council documents in about a week, and kind of shortly thereafter, then the sort of full list will become public. But the applicants themselves have not yet been notified about whether or not their application is being recommended for funding or not. So I can't speak to that, and or to sort of the Verde question
of the type of projects?
Yeah, absolutely. I can, so it won't be any of the like really interesting ones, because those were like the unusual ones, because those ones I think people would recognize them. But I can tell you that and I did see there was a question in the chat about kind of like some concrete, like where's the sort of like concrete examples. And we definitely are seeing some projects that are kind of the stuff that you would expect, like this bread and butter, deep energy efficiency retrofits paired with, distributed generation, renewable generation, certainly air source heat pumps, like those kinds of improvements to buildings, and with a focus on our priority populations, communities of color and low income communities, both in multifamily housing and in single family housing, but certainly with a lot of focus on sort of providing improvements to buildings where people live, so residential specifically. So on the clean energy projects, that's kind of what we're seeing. I mean, there were a handful of applications that were for non-residential types of improvements to buildings as well, but a lot of focus on residential. And I think in part because of the way, because our program doesn't have a cost effectiveness test like a lot of traditional climate programs do, we did see a lot more really deep energy retrofits, which was our desire and our intention in the way that we built the scoring matrix, to try and like incentivize people, once you're in a home, to really like do a deep energy retrofit, sort of improving the building at the same time, and also kind of avoiding a situation which we have seen in efficiency programs across the country, where kind of go in and scoop the cream off the top, and then nobody ever kind of goes back to do the deeper energy work. On the green infrastructure and regenerative ag, we saw those are all projects. I mean, sort of the clean energy portfolio and the green infrastructure and regenerative ag, those are all projects with physical improvements, and they are in many ways, like the physical improvement parts of them are kind of what you would expect. So you're going to see tree planting and bioswales and community gardens that are using regenerative agricultural practices and things like that. And then there are other components to the project that are a little bit more focused, that sort of like integrate advancing racial justice. So that's just as an example. I did see another question about planning projects, and maybe if I could just add a kind of a little bit of a description of that. I can't speak to sort of the organizations that applied for them, but just to give you a flavor of the kinds of activities that will be funded in planning projects, they include research, a lot of community engagement, staff time to do project development, hiring technical expertise like engineers or other kind of technicians that they might need to be able to help inform the development of the project. So those are the kinds of things that we are seeing in the planning grants, like those kinds of activities.
Okay, thank you. Tim, I was wondering, is there any business or company that's a member of your organization that would surprise us?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that you would be surprised by any of them. There are, it covers from, one of our board members is a member from Vigor, a company that repairs ships, giant company doing large industrial work, and they have a commitment to making progress on climate change, addressing climate change. So that's we have a lot of very large companies, and we're growing now in the smaller companies. So I wish I could rattle off a dozen, but
That's okay. I'm just
yeah,
trying to get a feeling for
sure,
the
sure.
sort of companies, especially in these times when support of climate change policies is rapidly changing. So there was a mention of this rulemaking committee for the DEQ, and I was wondering, for the two people that are participating on that rulemaking committee, what's your experience been, and do you see a success at the end of it?
Oriana, you want to go first?
I think it's going to be a difficult process. I think that this is a rulemaking advisory committee that has more voices from environmental justice communities than I think I've ever seen on a rulemaking advisory committee, except for maybe the Department of Land Conservation Development for the executive order. And that's really significant. But there's still a lot of industry folks who are at the table, who are pushing for things that will weaken the program. And they take up a lot of airtime in those spaces. And so I think it's hard to tell what is truly going to end up in the program versus what is like taking the time in the conversation space. But I think there are some glimmers of really good potential policies, but also some potential frustrations that are coming forward. And just speaking candidly, my apologies, Director Whitman, to put this on the spot here. But I think I have a lot of hope, in particular, how environmental justice organizations are being thoughtfully engaged by staff and the amount of resources they're putting forward to support our participation, both in terms of time and actual money resources that are helping to facilitate our capacity building.
You want to comment, Tim?
Sure, I'll comment as well. I had the opportunity to participate in the workshops that led up to the rulemaking advisory committee. So DEQ hosted a series of really interesting, productive, open forums for 6 months or so before this, and now we're in the rulemaking committee. So it's been a lot of education and lead up to this. So it's been a really rich set of conversations, but at some point we're going to need to dive down into some really specific and probably some pretty hairy details. And I really is a pretty heavy burden on Director Whitman and his team to take all this feedback and boil that down into a plan. So it's going to be hard work, and we look forward to reading the plan. And then we'll be commenting on our actual document at some point in Q3, I believe.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Robin, if I could, thank you. So appreciate the question and the comments also. And a couple of things I want to emphasize. One, the Rules Advisory Committee work is really important in getting input from people at the meeting, but also we're getting a lot of written input following the meetings, and a lot of it's very thoughtful and a little bit more in depth than what you can do verbally during the meeting. We're also very open to sitting down with all groups, all interests to get input outside of the Rules Advisory Committee process. And we're doing some outreach specifically to Oregon tribes also to try to get input from tribes on the program. But Tim's right and Oriana's right. There are going to be, at the end of this, there are going to be some difficult choices and trade-offs. We are going to be receiving analysis from consultants starting in about a month. I don't think it's going to quite be ready for this upcoming Rules Advisory Committee meeting. I'm not sure. I think they're right on the edge, but certainly the one after this, where you're going to start to see predictions of what we can do under different approaches, what the costs are, what the effects are on different communities. And that's where those and to some degree, there will be trade-offs between those things. And that's where things are going to get more difficult. in some areas there may be, we may be able to get win-wins and get co-benefits, but in some places there are going to be trade-offs. So the conversation will get more difficult as time goes along here, and we are trying to keep our commission, which is the ultimate decision maker, very engaged also. So they kind of know, they get a feel for the discussion that's going on and the direction that we're headed in. And there's an upcoming meeting of the Environmental Quality Commission on March 26 for those who are interested in following this process, in addition to the Rules Advisory Committee, which is coming up, I believe, on the 15th or 16th of March.
Okay, thank you. There's been a question about
Yep.
heating homes with wood. Does the Portland Clean Energy Fund address that sort of issue? Or is there any legislation about reducing or helping people replace their wood stove with electric heat?
I can certainly speak to what the Portland Clean Energy Fund does. And I guess maybe just and kind of to speak a little bit to some of the questions that I've seen in the comments too. We, after April 1st, will have our first set of grantees. So none of our projects have done anything yet. We are on the precipice of actually sort of doing some stuff. But we do, part of our scoring criteria for grant applications is GHG impact and improving the sort of health of residents of homes. So we did get applications that included sort of finding and, homes that still had wood stoves or were still using diesel heating oil to heat their homes and converting those to electric air source, using air source heat pumps. So, and they would score well because they certainly, unless you're using a really high efficiency biomass unit, you're going to have pretty heavy emissions. And so you're going to score well in that regard. And the health impacts are certainly there as well for most residential wood stoves.
Okay. One question I have is that we have an administration now in Washington that is keen to do a lot on climate, but the legislative branch may be stuck in one house to do a really progressive type of change and implementation of policy. So if we go around, and what would your hope be coming out of the federal sort of policy area to help Oregon meet its goals, or Portland? Is there some issue that you'd like to see the federal government do to help Portland and Oregon?
Well, I'll jump in first. The number one thing on my list is for the Biden, and this is something they can do administratively without action by Congress, is to have the Biden administration do a couple of things with regard to vehicle standards. As I showed in my presentation, that's 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and frankly, an area that is growing relative to the other sectors. So allowing California to move forward with its vehicle standards, and then the 13 or 14 other states that follow the California standards is the number one most important thing that the Biden administration could do in the short term for getting us back on track and reducing GHG emissions. Ultimately, they could adopt federal standards, national standards that apply across the country on vehicles that are even more aggressive than California. That would be great. And this is an area where they can act without Congress. So yes, I'm sure there will be court challenges, but it's something they could do immediately, and it is extremely important to Oregon in terms of meeting our goals.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I'll jump in. I think I'm really excited about the labor standards that are being built into the 100% clean bill at the federal level. The fact that prevailing wage is something that would be standardized across states is really significant. We've been fighting for good labor standards in House Bill 2021, but unfortunately, I think they'll run in a separate bill. But having that federal direction will be very significant, especially for a multi-state utility like Pacific Power that struggles to have labor standards in one state and then different work in another, and some of the jurisdictional issues that come up there. But I think the very most important thing we'd like to see from the federal government is strong incentives on the home retrofit side, on the community energy side. We have PSEF in Portland, but most of the state of Oregon doesn't have access to $40 to $60 million a year to develop projects. And so I think we really need some help from the federal government to create a steady stream of more flexible weatherization dollars, like our Healthy Homes program, and also dollars to support community energy development.
Anyone else? Okay, trying to go through some of these questions here. There's a question about eliminating gas-fired power plants from regulation. And I don't quite know what the question is, other than there's a concern about it. So.
Thanks, Robin. I think that one probably comes to me. This has been a hot issue in the Rules Advisory Committee on the Climate Protection Program. And there have been op-eds and letter and email campaign on this issue. So I think the main points I would make on this is getting to 100% clean electricity is really important to meeting our climate goals. We absolutely agree with that. And we do have a number of natural gas power plants in Oregon, existing plants, and we have one natural gas power plant that's been approved but has not been built yet, that is kind of sitting out there in the Hermiston area also. So I think there's a desire on the part of many to both see no more natural gas power plants built in Oregon, which something which I will say personally, I agree. If we're serious about getting to our climate goals, I think we should not be building additional natural gas power plants in Oregon. And then I think there's a desire to see our utilities move away, just as they've been moving away from coal for the most part, although we still buy coal from Montana and Wyoming and Utah, to move away over time from natural gas. And the desire is for that to be part of the climate protection program. And there are two problems with that and two reasons it has not been part of the main discussion in the rulemaking process so far. One is there are several legal impediments. We don't have authority to regulate natural gas plants and electric generation outside of Oregon generally. And so about 75% of the electricity, fossil fuel electricity in Oregon comes from out of state. So, and then there are some legal problems, frankly, with regulating the existing natural gas plants in Oregon as well that we haven't really gotten into the weeds on, but there's some barriers there that are significant. And then policy-wise and in terms of economics, if we were to try to regulate existing natural gas plants in Oregon, at least in the short and medium term, what the experts say is the utilities would simply go to the next cheapest source of power, which in most cases is going to be out of state, either natural gas or coal. And so we actually would not be helping reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the 100% clean legislation that is pending in Oregon is an approach on this issue that actually would be effective, we believe, and would get us moving as we need to 100% clean electricity sector. So as we electrify our home heating and our cars, we need that. That is an important tool for us to have in place. So there's no disagreement about that. It's just how do we get there best?
So one of the problems that I see is getting to having a transportation sector that's all electric is the infrastructure. I have a hard time seeing this being built out in Portland, especially. Can anyone comment on this, on how you see it moving forward? For example, does it require gas stations to revert to having electric power stations rather than gas? Or is it a whole new different kind of infrastructure? Do we have to have all housing incorporate electric charging stations, for example? Yes, I see that as a big block to having people buy electric vehicles.
I guess I could comment a little bit on that. In my work on the fourth board, we talk about this a lot, and most folks think you're absolutely right, Robin, that unless there's a whole lot more charging, we won't see as much adoption of vehicles as we would like to see. I don't hear much talk about gas stations as the ideal venue for charging. There's a lot of conversation about how do we get more charging in the right of way, in streets and parking spots and other things that are accessed every day. And then of course in homes, like you mentioned, big conversations about how from an equity perspective do we provide charging in homes where you don't have your own garage, you don't have your own driveway, or in a multifamily building like I live in. We happen to have a couple chargers in the basement, but how do we get more of that? There's legislation actually this year to advance requirements so that new buildings have a fair amount of charging infrastructure built in at the beginning. So yeah, all that stuff needs to happen together. And I would just say from an Oregon Business for Climate perspective, that's another great example of a way that we can create a lot of jobs for everyone, and we can do a lot of great workforce development in installing and building and creating charging infrastructure. And we have companies locally here who are in that business of manufacturing those devices. So it's another example of if Oregon can get out in front and be leaders on this, we can not only help achieve our goals of addressing climate change, but we can be leaders economically.
Are there any impediments at the city level to installing these chargers all over?
I don't know if Katie, you want to comment on being in the city, but I know that there are a lot of rules, and I see a lot of bootleg chargers next to the sidewalk and cords running across the sidewalk, and there are rules that need to be developed, I think, to enable that work and make it easier and safe.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll just say, if you want to see how some other leading cities are doing on this issue, go look at San Jose or Los Angeles. They're putting low-cost chargers on light poles all over the city in low-income communities. So, and they're reserving the parking around those light poles for charging for people with cars. This does not have to be a middle and upper income driven strategy. You can get used Leafs, you can get used electric vehicles on the market now that are quite affordable. And the Oregon incentives for electric vehicles include an incentive for used vehicles as well. So as this market develops, getting that message out to households that probably think of electric vehicle as a luxury item, and getting the education that shows what the long-term costs are to a household for purchase and ownership of a vehicle and how they can charge and how it can work. We've got a big education job to do.
I want to thank you all. Our time is running out, and so give you a big clap and hand it back to Debbie.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to our speakers. That was a stimulating and informative discussion. I learned a great deal and I'm very grateful to all of you for taking time to join us this evening. We appreciate the critically important work that you do to improve and maintain a clean and healthful environment, especially for people who work and play close to the sources of pollution. Clearly, we all have work to do. You've given us some great ways that we can participate, and thank you. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. If you're not already a member, we'd be happy to welcome you to join with us. We would also value your support in presenting these and other relevant programs. Please see our membership and donor information at lwvpdx.org. This is Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. With cases of the COVID virus decreasing, vaccinations increasingly available, and spring flowers blooming, we're looking forward to better times ahead. Take care, stay safe. Thank you.